speaking, it's important to note that I'm speaking from a non-Indigenous perspective, as someone that has done quite a lot of research with Aboriginal peoples and also just in the Aboriginal sort of issues space or Aboriginal studies space. If I was talking to other non-Indigenous researchers, one of the first things I suppose I would emphasise is that it's important to be fully cognizant of the existence and valuable diversity within the Aboriginal population. So we're not talking about one group of people, and we're certainly not talking about a certain set of characteristics. There's no guidebook on how to engage or what's culturally appropriate that you can just replicate across the board. So that's the first thing to really take into account. You've got to work with the people you're working with and not make assumptions based on other groups you might have worked with in the past. So if I was to talk about the best case scenario in terms of research projects, that would be that the research questions, the aims and objectives are grounded, and what I mean by that is that they are developed through dialogue with relevant Aboriginal groups, bodies or individuals, depending on what the project is about. And this is where the question of who will benefit from the research and how can be fully explored and honestly kind of thought about, because that's something that in the research space is not always clear. So once there is a sort of shared research focus that's been grounded in people's priorities, local people's priorities, or who you're working with, you know, it's of great value to have the opportunity to work with Aboriginal researchers to develop methodologies and to collect data. And that process can't be underestimated. And it's at this stage that you can really explore the meaning of research. So it's important not to assume that we all know what research is. And so it can be quite challenging for non-Indigenous researchers when you come into this space, because you have to be open to having your own assumptions about research challenged. And that's sort of part of it. As non-Indigenous people, or maybe as academics, it's important to be open to our own assumptions being challenged. It's also important, if you're in a project like this, to really think about and talk with your colleagues about the possible risks that your Aboriginal co-researchers might be exposed to as part of the research process that as a non-Indigenous person you may not have considered. So by building up shared understandings about the research project and the research process, the process of analysis and write-up can also be a joint activity, and this is where you can get real rigour into your research and a real depth of meaning if you involve all your co-researchers or your co-researcher in the process of analysis and write-up as well. But to then go sort of to the reality, yet just like with many issues in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander space, the larger system often impacts and influences how research projects are undertaken. So research institutions, systems of funding, definitions of research positions, and research outputs do constrain and influence your capacities to engage with Aboriginal people in the ways I've just talked about, in terms of from the beginning of the project right till the end. And so it isn't always possible to have the grounded kind of engaged process that you want to have. This doesn't mean that you should stop trying to fight for that. But if you do find yourself in a position where, you know, that's not how the project's been designed, you know, sometimes you might find yourself simply being a researcher, researching Aboriginal peoples, or rather particular issues in the Aboriginal space. And you can't deny that as a non-Indigenous person, this is kind of problematic. The best you can do though is be as committed and as thorough as you can in terms of identifying the different lenses and assumptions that you might be bringing to the study, particularly those around notions of privilege and race, around ideas of disadvantage, dysfunction and deficit. And it is always important to be working and improving your listening skills, your ability to be humble, and your capacity to allow people to be experts in their own lives. Also, you can always seek out Indigenous colleagues. You don't want to overwhelm them with stuff, but I'm sure they'd be happy to have discussions with you when you get to, findings and what do you think about this, or what do you think about this approach, and just test it with your colleagues. And there's also a large and growing body of literature written by Indigenous peoples, both internationally and in Australia, that you really should know about and you really should have read and engaged with.